Hello. I actually played hooky from church this morning because I haven't been feeling too well. Last weekend I spent the weekend up in Monteagle Mountain in the rain and the chill with a bunch of college and young adults, and I think it was too much for me at my age. But anyway, bear with me a little bit. There's a very ancient story about a really decent fellow who was blessed with a great and large family, lots of land, wealth, and he was actually very faithful to God himself. And if we would have looked at this man, we would have even determined perhaps that he had more than enough. But then this very troubling wager took place in which the devil came to God and said, I'll bet you in no time at all I can drop that guy to his knees until the point that he defies and denies you. And God basically said, bring it on. And it happened that except for his own life and the life of his wife, everything that he had was taken from him in a matter of moments. And when that last messenger came up to him to tell him that all of his children were dead, one thing that the devil said was right. That guy dropped to his knees. But this is what Job said. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. You know, I was preparing a few thoughts for about gratitude and thanksgiving for this evening, and I encountered a lot of sayings on the internet that are really pleasant. Now, I've always been on the lookout for things that will lift my spirits, and I loved words, and I found lots of nice things, but frankly, little smiley-faced sayings really don't have a way to get through my kind of tough exterior. But I did discover a lot of things. I'm not going to share many of them with you, but I've got a few slides to kind of kick off my little text here, and I believe the chronology of these slides will lead us up to the topic at hand, and then I'll get on with it. So this is great. Here's the first thing. When I Googled the word in the Google images, when I put the word grateful, that's a sad commentary on our culture, I think. But, of course, most of you know that this is the Grateful Dead. This is a band that kind of started when I was in high school in the late 60s and kind of peaked when I was in college. And all my friends were like gaga about this band. They loved them, and they followed them around the country. And I never liked them, but they even played at my college homecoming weekend when I was a sophomore. To my ear, they were perpetually out of tune. That's where I learned it from the Grateful Dead. Okay, here's another music-related slide. I hope you can read this. Yeah, this is a guy named Steve Lacy who was a pretty incredible saxophone player, and you can see he didn't have a real long life, but I can just see him digging deeply into his kind bag to say something nice about Kenny G. I have to be grateful to him for proving that the instrument can be played all different kinds of ways. So that's a sweet one. And then the next one is something that I found pretty interesting too. It's apparently a former, I don't know if you can read that. It's a former lottery winner who is slowly realizing that his or her experiences of gratitude are far outpacing his or her experiences of happiness due to gambling success. So you can see, anyway, it's not worth paying too much attention to. And now, here's a question I'll ask to you charade players on the next slide. If this longhorn steer is playing a game of charades, what is he trying to get you to say? The grass is always greener on the other side, I think is the answer to that question. I assumed somebody would get that, but you didn't. And then finally, the slide that may have been up earlier in the evening. Enough is a feast. Now, my sweet, you see it says Buddhist proverb at the bottom there. My sweet Baptist mother would be, she wouldn't speak to me for a month if she knew I included that Buddhist proverb in a Christian sermon, but we'll get over that too, and so will she. Would you all say a prayer with me, please? Eternal God, thank you for the opportunity to be together as we talk tonight and share the challenge of being grateful and thankful. Indeed we are, but we need to learn how to express it in more profound ways. And we ask for your help in that this evening. In Christ's name, I pray these things. Amen. So what is enough, and when does it become a feast? Now, there are many in this room who have traveled to so-called third world countries, and you've shared your time and your resources, and you've delivered compassionate aid and assistance to those that we perceive to be perhaps the most needy among our brothers and sisters. Others of you have framed walls and put roofs on Habitat for Humanity homes, and I suppose most of you have either been on a Nashville truck run, a Nashville Food Project truck run, or spent a Friday evening with our friends at Room in the Inn in South Hall. And if your responses are anything like mine, our notions of enough are challenged in each of these situations. When can a cup of clean water, a bowl of porridge, and 2 loving arms rise to the occasion of a feast? Perhaps when they are all you have. And when does an 1,100 square foot home become a mansion? Perhaps when, for the first time in your life, you have a place to call your own, within which you are able to shelter and nurture those you cherish. And when does a hearty noonday meal served from the back of a truck on a city street become a feast? Perhaps when it's the only hot and healthy meal you've had for a week. Enough is a feast. But then what is enough for those of us who have seldom, if ever, arrived at a place of tremendous physical need? Those of us who have always had a roof over our heads and clothing on our backs and foods in our stomachs. Are these basic human needs enough to satisfy our longings, or do we want more? Of course we want more. And I certainly don't stand up here and condemn those desires, because I have a very well-developed more gene that has often raced out of control. However, I've observed that when the preoccupation with wanting more outpaces our appreciation for that which we have, there is a dangerous and unhealthy imbalance. Think about the arc of your own lives. When you were 16, you may have worked at a fast food chain restaurant or as a babysitter, earning, say, minimum wage. And that modest income probably bought you a couple of hamburgers, put some gas in the family car, and afforded you the opportunity to go to a movie or bowl a few games once in a while. That was enough. Some of us attended college or enrolled in a trade school or entered the military, and subsequently we landed a job at a bank or a school or on a construction site or at an insurance agency with a starting salary of $15,000. That meager amount allowed you to rent your own apartment, buy a used car, and eat at a restaurant once in a while. That was enough. And up the ladder we climbed, and the 15 grand maybe became 30. And if we're lucky, maybe it became 60 or maybe even 120. And not once did we stop and say to our boss, you know, Bob, I really feel like I'm making enough, so I'm going to forego that raise this year. No, we take it and we convince ourselves that we're worth every penny of it, and maybe we are. You see, enough changes, or at least our definition of enough changes. Isn't it often the case in this life that enough suddenly becomes not enough, and then the desire for more. And more becomes not enough, and then the desire for more. And this cycle continues until we come to understand that not enough is not a feast. Not enough is a dark and lonely banquet where one typically dines alone. One regrets the jour. And I don't say that because I've observed it. I say that because I have sat at such a table, and shame on me. So finally, the question is, how do we become content with the idea that whatever we have at the moment is enough, and enough is a feast? Well, I began with a synopsis of the beginning of the book of Job, which I suspect most of you recognize. And now I'd like to make, in closing, a brief visit with the Apostle Paul as he approached the end of his life. And by the way, for guys like Cyril and me, I would just remind us that he was like 62 when he died, so it's... Anyway, this is kind of hard to read, but just to kind of set the background for the way I'd like to close this. Oh, you can see it a lot better up here, and so can I. All right, most of you have opened the back of a Bible and seen Paul's missionary journeys, and I'm not going to bore you with the details, but I did want to point out a couple of things, and I can't see it. Yeah, up here in this corridor, there's a town called Lystra, and I just want to make it known to you that Paul was stoned there, and when I say stoned, I mean they threw rocks at him. Let's be clear about that. And I started with the Grateful Dead slide, so. And he was left for dead on a pile of rocks and barely dragged himself away. So that was a bad day. Up in Philippi, which is almost at the top there, on the same journey, Paul was imprisoned. Back in Jerusalem, way over here on the bottom right, Paul returned there, and he was arrested again and put in jail, and they tried to kill him there in Jerusalem. And then if you follow the purple line and then the red line, you'll come way over here to the island of Malta, where you may recall that Paul was shipwrecked. And I think that's where they started the fire on the beach, and he reached in the fire and pulled out the snake that grabbed a hold of his arm. So here's my point. Paul finally got to Rome. He was put in prison there again, and then he was finally martyred by Nero after the burning of Rome in 16 AD. What's my point? Tough life. Paul spent the last 20 years of his life on all of those purple and yellow and red journeys, and he was hungry, thirsty, broke, and always in danger constantly, along with those things that I've just mentioned. Paul is now in Rome, and I think Clay preached about some of this today, this morning in his sermon. But he's in Rome, and he decides to write a letter to that congregation way up north in Philippi there, a congregation that he dearly, dearly loved. And we know it as his letter to the Philippians, which is also referred to parenthetically as the Book of Joy, because it's a catalog of wonderful, hopeful verses and passages. And there's so much to glean from these 4 chapters, but as it relates to the topic of what is enough, few verses get to the heart of the issue as these. Paul says, I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. So in the end, after Paul's remarkable life, Paul's perspective on that life had to do with one thing, and one thing only, his relationship with Jesus. Christ was not only enough for him, Christ was all he had. So I wish for all of you a joyous week of Thanksgiving, and I pray that each of us will recognize what we have, whatever that may be, and rejoice in it. And I pray that whatever we have, we deem enough, and remember that enough